Hello, and welcome to the Transforming Loneliness interview series. I'm Laura Parker, the creator and host of the series. Transforming Loneliness approaches loneliness with fresh and unexpected ways of seeing and responding that cultivate connection, belonging, and love. Today, I am truly honored to have Janina Fisher with me. Janina Fisher is an internationally known expert on the treatment of trauma, author of Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, and co-author with Pat Ogden of Sensory Motor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Attachment and Trauma. I've participated in a few of Janina's trauma trainings. What I love about Janina is how she blends warmth, generosity, and humor with expert insight and skill. Welcome, Janina. Thank you so much for sharing your voice in this conversation.
I'm pleased to do that. Yes.
So let's get started just with a definition of trauma. You know, I know that the trauma field has been going through a lot of changes in the last decade. Would you share with our audience the definition of trauma that you use in your work?
Yes. I use a definition of trauma that comes from Karen Sack-Whitney, who is one of the pioneers in the trauma field. And she defines trauma as a single event, a series of events, or a set of enduring conditions in which things happen. You know, if you think of wartime or child abuse or domestic violence, those are enduring conditions. Day in, day out, we don't feel safe. And then, so the definition is we have to have a single event, a series of events, or a set of enduring conditions in which the individual's capacity to cope, stay present, tolerate the experience is overwhelmed, and he or she experiences a felt sense of threat to life, sanity, or bodily integrity. So the circumstances don't have to be objectively life-threatening. You know, if I'm mugged at knife point, I'm going to feel a sense of, oh my God, I'm going to be killed. My mugger really just wants my money, doesn't want to kill me. But the fact that the mugger has a weapon will convey that subjective sense, I'm going to be killed.
Yes, and so what happens subjectively for the trauma survivor that qualifies it as trauma?
It is the fear, it's the fear of death, the fear of annihilation, and it's the feeling of being overwhelmed.
Okay. Go on. Was there something else?
So it's beyond our capacity to comprehend or to tolerate.
Okay.
Which means that currently a lot of the term developmental trauma is being thrown around a lot these days.
Yeah.
Basically, developmental trauma simply means trauma that occurs in childhood. But the term is being used for things like, I had a withdrawn, uninterested mother, I had a depressed father, I had a father who wasn't available, I had a mother who didn't speak. And those are not traumatic. Those are painful, but not traumatic.
Right. Okay. So when I started considering loneliness in depth, I realized pretty quickly that loneliness and trauma are intricately connected. How do you see the connection between loneliness and trauma?
Trauma is a profoundly lonely experience. Even if we get traumatized in a group, for instance, in Hurricane Katrina, thousands and thousands of residents of New Orleans were traumatized, but they didn't feel, oh, we're in this together. They each felt profoundly alone with the experience. an airplane crash is a group experience, but each person feels profoundly alone. And of course, if the trauma, and also things like child abuse and domestic violence are secretive, sexual assault is secretive. So, being held up is secretive. People don't do it in front of a crowd. They do it when they can get people one-on-one. So often there is an objectively lonely situation on top of which the trauma makes it feel even more profoundly alone.
Right. So also, I've been also thinking that the experience of dissociation can feel subjectively lonely because the person is alienated from themselves. So there's this internal disconnection that also I wondered if you consider that could also have a loneliness aspect to it.
I mean, it certainly could. It's not something I've ever heard someone complain of, but it certainly could. Because most people who are alienated from themselves don't really want to be closer to themselves.
Right, right. So let's see, I'm just checking my notes here. So it seems like one aspect of the loneliness is that there's a feeling that there's no help, there's no one around.
Right, there's no one to hear the cries, no one to come to the rescue, and then no one afterward to support and help the victim.
Right. And then also in earlier conversations that we had, we talked about the difference between wanting the help from the outside, that the person who's traumatized often is in a state of thinking that help will come from the outside. And it seems like a part of your work is shifting that to helping the client to have some different inner resources. Could you say more about that?
Well, I think it's very natural that in the midst of some horrific experience, we want somebody to come and help us. I think that is as natural as anything could be. But I think what is more problematic for people than the immediate impact of feeling profoundly alone and overwhelmed is that the memory of feeling alone pervades the next decades of experience. So after the trauma, we don't remember clearly the events because we were overwhelmed, but we remember how it felt. Only we don't know we're remembering because it's not connected to an event. So many of my clients over the years have felt profoundly lonely, despite having friends, families of procreation, having often not being alone, physically alone. There is this feeling of painful loneliness that is a memory.
Yes. So how do you work with that painful loneliness that is a memory?
Well, it's difficult because a lonely person, a person who feels lonely, I should say, because I think there's a difference. And let me say one other thing about another pattern that we see a lot in trauma. After a traumatic experience, often victims are left with this feeling of utter aloneness that is very emotionally painful, but also are left with a fear of human beings.
Yes.
Right? Either a fear that nobody comes, nobody gets it, nobody understands, nobody wants to hear about it. Or the fear of being attacked, used, and abused in some way.
Mm.
So that sets up a situation in life where often traumatized individuals will isolate themselves, they'll push people away because they feel this anxiety or distrust.
Right.
And in fact, I just came from a client session with a client who throughout her adult life has really pushed away anyone who tried to come close to her.
Mm-hmm.
Not in an angry, inappropriate way, but she's distanced or she's drawn some lines in the sand. But the result of pushing people away or of isolating, I don't answer the phone, I don't answer the doorbell, is that then there is a feeling of utter aloneness.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's a terrible dilemma, because if I were to say to that client, well, it might be less lonely if you reached out or even just answered the phone, she'd say, I don't feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a rock and a hard place, not feeling safe in the company of other human beings, but then paying the price in loneliness.
Right. Yes. So, yeah, and I can see that that could be a continuum. Like there's people actually in my practice who may not even be aware that they're pushing people away.
Mhm.
They may answer their phone, they may have social engagements, but there's more subtle ways that they're actually pushing. They're not forthcoming, they're not revealing themselves, they're not sharing, or they're not letting the other person in more subtle ways. So yeah, it can be very confusing when people say, I want more connection, and then they don't realize how they're participating in it not happening, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's very hard to talk about because someone who is feeling loneliness is in pain, and and that might not be the moment that they can hear exactly what you just said so beautifully and empathically. So it's very, very, very difficult.
Yes. So one thing that is so innovative about your work, Janina, is that you have this way of working with the child parts and the wounded parts, that you also then train your clients how to have this kind of healing conversation with themselves. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Right. So, um, I believe that our distressing emotions, barring catastrophe in our adult lives, that most of our distressing emotions are feeling memories held by young child selves.
Mm.
And so I work with people, and I've written about an approach in which I try to help individuals notice these painful feelings as communications from young children.
Mhm.
And 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 because I find that most trauma survivors are very, what's the word, they're very rejecting of the idea of accepting themselves. But
Yes.
it's much harder to reject a 3-year-old part. It's harder to reject an 8-year-old little kid than it is to reject yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I would start to say, um, I wonder if that lonely feeling is a message from some young part of you who's trying to say, I'm so lonely in here. Why isn't anybody there? And then you say, I'm so lonely too. And that child feels even more alone
Mm,
because you're saying, yeah, you should feel alone. I feel alone too.
mm,
And so I try to help people to separate, not in a mindful way, not in a distancing way.
mhm.
I help people to separate their physical grown up body and mind from this emotion that is a communication from a young part. And it's very lovely. It can I was interested when you said I train
Oh
like
yeah, right. Wrong
I was
word, I
thinking,
think.
yeah, I was thinking more like I beg them. Right? Because people who are in emotional pain don't want to be trained, but sometimes they can be encouraged.
Yeah.
So today, actually, my client, the client I saw just before you and I got online together, um, started to feel a young part of her that held a lot of hurt and disappointment, and she began to cry. And I asked her to notice those tears as the tears of that little girl,
Mm,
because from what was coming up, this little girl who had wanted so much to be seen and nobody saw her, it just felt to me that the tears were the tears of this little girl responding to the fact that the client and I were both seeing her.
yeah.
And because what I've seen in this client before is that she can feel sadness and she can cry, but nothing resolves.
Ah,
But today, when she noticed the tears as the tears of this little girl, who had been such a bright spirit, even though nobody was noticing it, uh, it really felt like something settled and resolved.
yes. And just, I know we just have a couple minutes left, but when you mentioned bright spirit, it made me think that this is one of the positive outcomes of doing this work, is if you can connect with the pain of the young child, then you also can reawaken these wonderful resources and qualities that the young parts have.
Absolutely, and help people appreciate their child selves, right? Because I think so often as children we are bright spirits, we are sharp cookies, we are inquiring minds, and often without that mirroring from good parenting, we don't know that we're so sharp or that we glow so much. And so it's very reparative for these young parts to hear themselves seen and acknowledged. And it's wonderful for the client to feel, oh, this child who was treated so badly was actually a really smart cookie. And I can be proud of her or him.
Yes, and I can hear that one dimension of how this heals loneliness is that the child part feels in relationship with the adult part of the client. So
Abs-
there's a there if there's a relationship of attentiveness and responsiveness, then that really heals the loneliness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the work is very, very simple. Sometimes I just ask clients if they can notice the lonely feeling and just bring a hand to the place where they feel so lonely. And most of us feel loneliness in the heart or in the chest. It's really interesting. And so when they bring that hand to the lonely feeling, they're bringing a hand to that child
Mm.
to whom nobody reached out.
Yes. And even there in that intervention that you just mentioned, you're bringing in something that we haven't talked about at all today, but the role of the body. You know, that is there's a lot of feelings, sensations that go with that emotion, and that's part of the integration of the healing.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. And you don't need a lot of words to do this. You know, any of us, if we're feeling anxious or alone or uncertain, we could just bring a hand here. Nobody thinks that we're doing a therapeutic intervention, and we can be there for ourselves, quite literally.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for all these words of wisdom today, Janina. Is there anything else that you would like to let our audience know?
Well, I'd like to let them know about my book, my new book,
Yes.
Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, which, although it doesn't address loneliness per se, I think the approach and the techniques really work beautifully with people who are suffering from loneliness, whether it's loneliness as a memory or loneliness as a here and now today experience.
Yes, and as you mentioned previously, this book was written both for clinicians and for the general public, so it's very accessible.
Right. So yes, I wanted to make sure that someone who was suffering could pick it up and read it and it would be accessible. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really thrilled to have your
Welcome.
voice in this conversation.
Thank you, and such a lovely and important project.